recognise Andrew Stone as a regular here on Sky News. He was formerly the chief economist to Tony Abbott during his time in power, and prior to that worked at senior levels for the Reserve Bank and as an official inside the Treasury Department in Canberra. I might add here, Andrew didn't just work for Mr Abbott during his time as PM, he also did the hard slog of opposition. And along with many others on the coalition's front bench, I know I relied on Andrew's policy depth and his economic nous as we developed the election platform around budget repair, scrapping the carbon tax and making government smaller. With all of this experience behind him and a PhD in mathematics from Stanford, no less, Andrew Stone has written a new book of policy ideas designed to get the country back on track. It's called Restoring Hope, Practical Policies to Revitalise the Australian Economy. It's a good Christmas present for anyone who wants a bit of hope too in our current political climate. And it's a coherent, comprehensive but politically achievable economic agenda for a federal government that's willing to tackle what's important to our country over the next 3 to 5 years. Now in it, Andrew Stone calls for heavy cuts to immigration and foreign student numbers as well. He wants to see government construct a new coal-fired power station. He's got plenty of ideas to re-energise productivity and to lift wages in Australia. Andrew Stone joins me now. All right, Andrew, I'll put you in the hot seat now. Why write a book? It's no mean endeavour. This is a substantial book. It's not a book of fiction. Why go to all this effort to write a book?
Thanks, Peter. Well, I guess a twofold reason. One reason is that I'm actually quite concerned still about the state of the Australian economy. I mean, to be fair, credit to the government, it's got the budget back more or less into balance, and we haven't suffered a technical recession for the last 12 years. But nevertheless, for many Australians, the last dozen years since the end of the Howard government has been quite a dispiriting and difficult period. Our growth per capita has been well less than half the rate over the last 12 years that it was under the Howard government. Wages growth has been extremely weak for quite a while now. At the same time as electricity prices have skyrocketed, which has made life very difficult for struggling families. Our overall budgetary performance has been quite subpar. We've run 10 large deficits. As I say, it's good we're back more or less in balance now, but nevertheless, as a result, our Commonwealth net debt is at a record level. And the economy is actually very vulnerable, much more vulnerable, in fact, than we were before the global financial crisis to a major economic shock from overseas. Not only is our Commonwealth net debt at a record level compared to where it was, we actually had money in the bank, no net debt at all at the end of the Howard government, but also household debt as a share of household disposable income is considerably higher now. It was already at an extremely high level by international standards before the global financial crisis, but it's actually at a higher level now than it was then. So I basically have these three concerns that we need to do something to help struggling families, we need to strengthen growth, and we need to make the economy less vulnerable to economic shocks. But rather than just say we need to do these things and as it were, carp from the sidelines, so why doesn't someone do something about this? I thought, well, I should actually sit down and try to set out in detail, specifically, concretely, what I think a government could practically do about this. And so that's why I've set out what is, I hope, a comprehensive but achievable 3 to 5 year program for a resolute government.
And it's politically doable. This is what I like. I mean, there's no shortage of books that are almost impossible to implement in the way our democracy works in 3-year terms, and I guess the predominance in a lot of forums of the public service and their mindset pushing governments who get the authority at the election to do something, or the mandate at the election, but then don't tend to, by attrition, achieve it. I want to ask you, yesterday in comments he made around the release of MyEFO, the mid-year budget update, the Treasurer talked about the big 3 Ps that drive our economic performance in Australia: productivity, participation and population. Now, you and I have talked about this. The one of those that is always tweaked by Treasury, basically as a Ponzi scheme to improve the budget numbers, is population. You bravely in this book say we've really got to cut our population back and cut it back hard. What's your economic argument? Well,
to be fair, I'm still advocating what I think would be a quite rapid immigration program, but an immigration program at the sort of level that we had under the Hawke, Keating and Howard governments, which was about 100,000 net overseas migration a year, And I make the point in the book that if you look at that 25-year period, when we had that sort of level, that was actually the fastest, on a per capita basis, the fastest level of immigration of any developed country, with two exceptions. One, Israel, because of a massive influx of Jews from Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and tiny Luxembourg, which had a population of less than 500,000. It's a tax haven, so a few thousand people looking to minimise their tax.
Yeah, but Andrew, let me just jump in there. If you're saying we should come down to 110,000 net overseas migration,
so we're
tell
way higher
people
than
what
that.
we are currently at in terms of net overseas numbers.
At the moment, last year, 2018-19, the net overseas migration was almost 250,000. It's an extraordinary level. It's averaged almost 230,000 over the last decade, or rather for the period since mid-2006. So this is the thing, we had an extremely rapid program, and then we doubled it. And that's had all sorts of implications. It's driven, it's significantly driven house prices higher, which has made life very difficult for young families trying to get into the market. That in turn has actually contributed, I believe, to our fertility rate falling to the lowest level in Australia's history in 2017, the last year for which we have data. But it's also put considerable pressure on wages. The fact that you have a huge influx of people, even as the jobs market, the rate of jobs growth over the last decade has been considerably slower than it was under the Howard government. As a result, you've got this supply-demand imbalance, and the upshot of that is that wages have been driven down. The bargaining position of Australian workers has been undercut, and that's made life very difficult for people.
Right, you call out in your book, and I'll give the quote here so we don't get anyone offside, the shallowness, the lack of intellectual coherence, the impracticality, and the resort to commitments off in the never-never as a poor substitute for concrete policies of current policymakers. You're pretty scathing of your former colleagues in Treasury there, mate. What do you want to see happen in terms of energy policy?
Well, I should say that was a comment not just about Treasury, but in general about the quality of the economic debate that we've had, I think, for the last decade, and that's why I wanted to
Treasury paraphrasing was my own, yes. I'll let you off the hook there.
But on
energy policy,
on energy policy, this is an area where this is a tremendous comparative advantage of Australia. It's what we built much of our economic success over the 50, 60 years immediately post the Second World War on, is the fact that we had this tremendous endowment of coal, natural gas, uranium as well and so forth, which allowed us to have energy prices, both for households and for businesses, that were well less than the average of other countries. Unfortunately, since the turn of the century, we've managed to completely undo that situation, as well as making our the reliability of our, undercutting the reliability of our supply. So the way there are various ways we can solve that, but one of the immediate ways we could do that is actually we need to increase baseload power. There's been a tremendous undercutting of baseload power to the point where there's serious risk of major blackouts during the current summer. And an easy way to do that would actually be to rebuild state-of-the-art coal-fired power stations on the current Liddell and the previous Hazelwood power station sites. Those are two sites that already had coal-fired power stations on them. So all the environmental approvals are in place, all the infrastructure for getting coal and so forth to the power stations is there. And that is an easy way in which we could relatively quickly restore a comfortable margin of baseload power, because that's been severely eroded. There are various additional steps that we could take on energy, and there are a range of other things we can do in productivity as well that I set out in the book.
What did you think of the comments from AEMO, the regulator, last week, that basically we don't need coal-fired power generation beyond 2040?
I find this terribly dispiriting. We are constantly promised that the cheapest way to provide power now is through renewables. If that's true, why do we have to have all these subsidies continuing? And secondly, this flies in the face of the available evidence. We have moved to renewables, and now power prices, retail power prices on the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics data, are treble what they were at the turn of the century. That's an extraordinary indictment of the way in which we have transformed our energy market to place this increasing reliance on intermittent renewables. Hydropower is fine, that's one thing, that's an on-demand power source. But the undermining through a variety of structural features of the market, the creation of this sort of Byzantine monster of a sort of pseudo-market, and then our undermining of baseload power has driven prices sky high, and yet the response of AEMO is to say, let's do more of the same. It's deeply bizarre, in my view, that they would take that view.
Well, it's deeply bizarre, you're absolutely right. Lots in there, Andrew. I love the idea that the universities, if the students don't get a job that earns them enough to repay their debt to the taxpayer via their HECS, the universities who obviously educated them poorly have to pick up that cost. I love that idea. I hope everyone gets a copy for Christmas. We read it. We have a fair income debate in this country about where we're headed and the policy that makes change as opposed to just Canberra gossip. I would love that. Andrew Stone, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Peter.